Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're really diving back in time, looking at a foundational piece of psychological research from 1895.
That's right, a paper called Types of Reaction by J. Mark Baldwin with some help from W.J. Shaw.
1895, and they were already asking some pretty big questions.
Absolutely. Things like, are reaction times consistent? Does it matter what we're paying attention to the sound or our own movement?
And why are people so different, even under the exact same conditions?
Exactly. These experiments were done back in 1892, 1893 at the Toronto Laboratory.
And they tried to be quite careful, didn't they, to make sure the results were actually comparable?
Yeah, they took precautions, like having participants do the tests around the same time each day, keeping the order of things consistent. Wanted reliable data.
Okay, so let's picture this lab in the 1890s. What kind of equipment were they working with?
Well, they had these instruments called chronoscopes, specifically the hip and the Darce involved chronoscopes. Think of them as super precise stopwatches for that era.
Measuring tiny fractions of a second.
Right, and they were controlled by a Koenig tuning fork for rhythm and a Murray motor. Pretty sophisticated for the time, really.
To keep the timing accurate.
Exactly. They noted the hip one was maybe a tad more reliable for absolute time, but they were mostly interested in the differences, the relative changes in reaction time.
Okay, so they've got the timer sorted. What did people actually do in these experiments?
It was pretty straightforward. The stimulus was just an auditory click, a sound,
Okay.
and the reaction, usually pressing down with the right forefinger, or sometimes a pinch mechanism with the Durosmal setup.
And they even tested in different environments.
They did. They had a normally lit room, and then they also used a dark closet within that room to see if light, or the lack of it, made a difference for reacting to sound.
Interesting. Who are the actual participants, the regents as they called them?
Well, the researchers themselves took part: Baldwin, who they labeled B, and Shaw, S.
Okay, researchers as subjects, common back then.
Very. They also had a student, Mr. Faircloth, or F, who apparently had quite ready and unconfused reactions. Good subject.
Right.
And data from another student, Mr. Crawford, C, from Princeton. His initial results were intriguing because his sensory reaction seemed faster than his motor one.
Ah, okay, so let's get into that, the sensory versus motor reaction distinction. Remind us what that means.
So the classic idea was a sensory reaction is when you focus on perceiving the stimulus, first hear the click, then react. A motor reaction is focusing on the movement itself, get ready to press.
And the assumption was usually that motor reactions are faster, right?
Yeah.
Less thinking involved.
That was the general thought. But Baldwin and Shaw's results, especially in their table 2, kind of threw a wrench in that.
How so?
Well, take Mr. Faircloth, F. For him, the motor reaction from focusing on the movement was actually significantly longer than his sensory reaction.
Really? Longer?
Yep. Which really questions that simple sensory faster than motor idea. It shows things are more complicated.
And even between Baldwin and Shaw themselves.
Yeah, B and S. Their absolute motor times were pretty close, but the difference between their sensory and motor times was quite distinct between them. More individual variation.
Okay, so the basic sensory motor split isn't the whole story. Did they look deeper into the motor reactions?
They did. They distinguished between focusing on the feeling of the movement, they call this kinesthetic, versus focusing on the sight of the hand moving, the visual motor reaction.
Okay, so feeling the press versus seeing the press.
Pretty much. And again, differences. For Baldwin B, the visual focus made his reaction longer than the kinesthetic focus.
Right.
But for Shaw, S, it was the opposite. Kinesthetic was faster than visual. And Faircloth. No real difference for him between the two.
Huh. So where you focus your attention during the action matters, but differently for different people. What about that light and dark condition? How did that pan out?
That's in Table 3, focusing just on B and S reacting to sound. For Baldwin, his sensory reaction time didn't really change between light and dark.
So seeing didn't affect his hearing the click and processing it.
It seems like it. Suggests maybe his auditory processing was pretty independent of vision. But Shaw was different.
How?
His sensory reaction was actually a bit faster in the dark.
Faster without light?
Yeah, but his motor reaction was slower in the dark. It hints that maybe Shaw relied more on visual cues for the actual physical movement part of the reaction.
Wow. Okay, so we're seeing all these individual wrinkles. How did Baldwin try to tie this all together? What was his interpretation?
Well, seeing these variations, some people faster on sensory, some on motor, light affecting motor reactions for some but not others, led him to propose this idea of types.
Mental types.
Yeah, mental types. He drew an analogy from the study of aphasia,
Yeah.
language disorders, which was a big topic then.
Aphasia. How does reacting to a click connect with language problems?
It's about the underlying processing. In aphasia, they were identifying sensory aphasia, trouble understanding language like auditory processing, and motor aphasia, trouble producing speech. The motor act, Baldwin speculated that maybe, just like with language, people have a general tendency, a type. Are you more wired to process things primarily through sensory input, hearing, seeing, or are you more geared towards the motor output, the doing, the moving?
So a sensory type person and a motor type person.
That's the idea. He thought your dominant type might influence how you react in these simple tests. It could explain why reaction time studies sometimes got conflicting results.
Because maybe researchers were unknowingly testing groups dominated by different types.
Exactly. He even suggested that reaction time experiments could potentially be a tool to identify someone's inherent mental type.
That's a fascinating leap, connecting reaction times to these broader cognitive styles. Did anyone else follow up on this?
Well, they mentioned Professor Flournoy's work briefly. Flournoy had talked about a visual type relating to visual imagery of movement. Baldwin clarifies that Flournoy's visual type is a bit different from the broader sensory type linked to aphasia. But he acknowledges Flournoy did sort of anticipate the distinction they made between visual motor and kinesthetic motor reactions.
Got it. So, wrapping up our look at this 1895 paper by Baldwin and Shaw, what are the main takeaways for us?
I think, firstly, it just hammers home that reaction time isn't simple. It's complex, influenced by attention, environment, lots of factors.
Right. Not just stimulus response?
Definitely not.
Huh.
Secondly, the huge role of individual differences. People just react differently, and simple rules often don't apply universally.
And thirdly?
Baldwin's theory of types. Even if the direct link to aphasia is debated later, this early idea that our basic processing tendencies might differ systematically is, I think, really insightful. It offered a way to start making sense of the variations.
It's a really valuable snapshot from J. Mark Baldwin and W. J. Shaw back in 1895, showing early attempts to grapple with the complexity of the human mind, linking perception, action, and these underlying cognitive styles.
Absolutely. Foundational work.
And it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? Thinking about yourself when you learn something new or react quickly. Do you feel you rely more on taking in sensory details or more on the physical doing of it? Could understanding your own type, in Baldwin's terms, tell you something about how you operate?
A fascinating thought to ponder. Definitely sparked by this century-old research